Okay, so today we have another presentation that I'm giving. If you were in the earlier presentation about information architecture, welcome back. And if you're new, then welcome. This is about succeeding with a performance measurement framework, really using data to hold us accountable for our success as opposed to egos, whims, emotions. I think what we can do here is similar to my last session. And again, if you weren't there, that's okay. Uh, we can either do the full presentation, and in this case, it's a lot of slides, but they're just a few words, or we can kind of cover the basics and then move on to Q&A. So I'll cover the basics first, but if you want um, the full presentation, just say full presentation in the chat. Or if you don't want the full presentation, then just say the short version or something like that. And we can move on to questions and answers or any sort of discussion that you'd like after we cover some of the basics. And if you have any questions immediately, just again, put them in the chat. I'll try to address them when it's appropriate. But a little bit about me. I am a technical consultant and solutions architect. I have my own company called Mindite, which is based here in Canada. I'm in British Columbia, currently on the Sunshine Coast. Very beautiful. If you see it really sunny behind me, that's why. But I'm actually from the United States. I'm from the Baltimore area. I got a lot of my career startup in technology in that general area, working in healthcare and education and a lot of different industries because I worked for digital agencies for a good part of my career, which has been going on for about 25 years now. And I work a lot with the Drupal community. I've been doing that for about 16 years. My big focus these days is on information architecture, UX strategy, digital strategy as a whole, and that's what I love. I'm a big advocate for open source software and user experience. So you'll see some of that come up through pretty much anything that I talk about because, well, I like connecting human beings with the technology that's supposed to serve them and supposed to benefit organizations. You can get in touch with me on LinkedIn if you'd like, and there's a QR code on the screen as well if you don't feel like typing all of that out. These slides are also available, so there will be a QR code for that in a second. But before we get started, just please let me know what role are you in? And I realize that some of you might be students, teachers, faculty with Stanford. That's fine too. But a lot of times I like to shape this discussion um, for where you are, meet you where you are, and make sure that I'm using a vernacular that might be a little bit more familiar or kind of tweak things a little bit in that direction. So if you want, put in the chat what it is that you do, and I'll take a look at that as I go through the slides. All right, got a developer. Also, hi from Squamish. Beautiful area up there, almost a Whistler. Really, really challenging when those roads end up closing now due to things like the landslide that happened earlier. Drupal implementation consultant. That is great. UX designer, developer, higher ed front end design, site builder, IT director. Yeah, yeah. So I think tech architect. I think this presentation might be for you, but you can be the judge of that. This QR code is for the slides that you're looking at, all of them. And the point of our presentation today is really just to talk about how you actually measure success. What sort of data can inform things like design strategies and priorities, how that develops into a growth engine, and how to make adjustments and continuous improvements to that. It is a team focused thing. So, stakeholders, decision makers, production team, management, everybody involved has a different perspective and skill set to bring to the table. And we really want our team to work together, not frustrated with what we should be doing and what's important. And opinions are important, but data can really help steer the ship as well. So without further ado, we're going to go pretty quickly through some slides because they don't really say too much. There are a few examples that I can share if we have time, and we'll certainly take questions after that. But if you want the short version, again, put in the chat that you want the short version, and we'll cover just the basics, and then I'll get to your questions. And if not, you can do the full presentation. So first and foremost, how do we measure success, and what are KPIs or key performance indicators? We'll get to that. First off, we want to really focus on why a performance measurement framework or PMF is important. And the purpose is really just to create some sort of a framework that's repeatable across projects that can help us guide our success. And there's different levels of investment and commitment that a team could really have, but any little part of this is at least heading you towards that guidance. And we don't want to just turn wrenches. And what do I mean? I mean, you don't want to just do busy work that makes you feel like you're productive because you're doing something. We want to actually do something that we can measure and see this is having an impact. It's helping our organization, it's helping our audience. But how do we do that? Well, we have to learn how to grow. And we can start by first identifying a unified team goal. What are we trying to accomplish? And then measure that impact. Learning together will help us understand where we're succeeding, but also more importantly, where we're failing. And you want to fail early, as they say. Nobody wants to suffer, but suffering is part of life. And if we can be honest with each other as to what points of suffering are most important for us to adjust for and correct, then we can suffer less and get back into effectiveness. And this will also help guide our growth. And what do we mean by growth? I don't mean like you're growing as a person or physically growing. I mean growth as in you have an objective and you're able to grow, mature, improve, that sort of thing. And this word comes up actually in things like Lean Startup. If you're not familiar with Lean Startup, fantastic book. Please read it. It also gave rise to like things like Lean UX, that sort of thing. And there's this idea of growth-driven design. There's actually a certification by HubSpot specifically about growth-driven design, which borrows from the Lean Startup. Lean is not a tech thing first and foremost. It's actually a manufacturing thing that started with Toyota. So if you want to learn about that backstory, it's really good. Again, Lean Startup. But they identify 3 different growth engines. Now, you don't need growth engines to build a performance measurement framework or identify KPIs, but these are sometimes secrets to what you may want to measure based on your type of organization and where you are with a project. And you're typically only using one growth engine. Some of this may be a little bit familiar and maybe some of it's not. I think we all have heard viral. And of course, sometimes when you have a startup, there's the paid engine of growth. You're putting money in to hopefully get some sort of a return. And we don't want speculation, the build it, they will come. Instead, it's we know that if we get the word out, then people will be attracted to this thing that we have. And then sticky engine of growth is this idea that you have some sort of recurring revenue or some sort of membership or something along those lines. And all of these things can be measured a little bit differently, but there are formulas for that. And these can go into the data points that you're actually tracking as one of your KPIs. So something to consider when you're defining KPIs. But I think maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. What are we doing any of this for? And I think academia certainly supports this notion. We have a hypothesis that a performance measurement framework allows us to build more effective, continuous improvements using data-driven learning as a team. Now, of course, we are mostly focused on things like digital interfaces, websites, apps, things like that when we're talking about something like webcamp and our focus here. But some of this can apply to your personal life if you have certain goals, whether it's a personal budget or a business that you're running. These are important things, and it's trying to hold yourself accountable instead of what I refer to as ego-driven design. You have a feeling, therefore you react, and it feels good because you did a thing. Well, let's use data aligned with our values and what we think is a goal that proves success. And these are the indicators. So within our hypothesis, there's a few things that we want to play out. So a performance measurement framework is comprised of a few components. First off, we've said this before, key performance indicators. And these aren't things like vanity metrics as they refer to them as sometimes, like page views and bounce rates are the classic example when it comes to websites. If I go outside of a store, like a Walmart or something, and I start counting cars, I can speculate and say, well, maybe that's an indicator that people are shopping at Walmart, but maybe they're just parking their car there. That's not necessarily the strongest indicator, and it could just be a vanity metric. So we want something more concrete, like how much revenue am I making per month? Or how many warm leads do I have? Or how many direct conversations am I having with people who are interested in my product or services? Or how many applications from students did I get? I mean, the list can go on, but the point is that you can point your finger at a measurable, quantifiable indicator that shows whether or not you're succeeding. And you can indicate what your target is for each one of those. So if you're below your target, you're not doing so hot. And if you're above your target, maybe you're exceeding it. But sometimes exceeding your targets is also bad. Like I'm a freelance contractor. I like to have about 6 clients, active clients at a time. If I had 20, I'd be pulling my hair out. That's too much. So indicators can sometimes be a range or a dial, if you will. Really up to you to define those. You also have key system attributes. These are the fundamental properties of a system that you build that you feel and should prove support your key performance indicators. And we'll explain that in a bit, but this is one of the main components. Other components to consider in helping to move the needle for your performance are things that you might hit on more of a routine level and can change over time. Key performance indicators typically don't change unless you have a major change in market, business, or audience. But objectives and key results are more, I'm doing a release of the software. What are we doing? Maybe I'm building the event calendar. So that's your objective. So what are the key results? The calendar is operational and it's usable by our team. People can enter events and they show up on the calendar. Those are key results. And release planning. I think a lot of people understand agile software development. So this is pulling a little bit from that. Release planning is making sure that you're reflecting what work needs to be done to make those improvements. And sometimes you come up with a plan and you don't get it all done, and that's okay. That's why it's important to have priorities. You put the most important, most urgent stuff at the top, and the thing that helps your priorities are things like knowing what your KPIs are and knowing what your OKRs are. And you want to test those things. You want to make sure that the things that you hypothesized, I'm going to make an improvement, here's the work that I'm going to do, that it's actually having an impact. So it needs to be something that's testable, and you should have those tests documented in some form so that way you can execute them as soon as that release is released to your audience and it's usable. So, okay, this is all theory and ideas. How do you create a performance measurement framework? Well, first, you define each one of those components. A key performance indicator is really rooted in the organization's purpose and its goals. So, for example, at a university, you want students to attend, you want teachers to want to work there, etc. That's pretty obvious. Or if I have an e-commerce store, I have revenue that I want to have, but I also want people to be browsing. So there's a bit of a conversion funnel that you may have where somebody comes into a product catalog, they take a look at a number of things, then eventually you hope to have a conversion, a purchase. And there's steps in that you can identify in the system Those are important things to observe in terms of system design and user interactivity, because that may help you identify your key performance indicators and know how to measure them. So, along with here's the quantifiable number, here's the target, you also want to identify what system is responsible for this. Maybe it's a CRM like HubSpot or Salesforce. Maybe it's just event tracking, like somebody clicked on a button. How many clicks am I getting? How many form submissions am I getting? So those are all trackable things, and that data is really important. Key system attributes are testable, they're failable, they're replaceable, they're valuable, they're durable. And what I mean by that is you can test whether or not it's supporting your KPIs. Not so much correlation causation, but you should be able to test those. And I'm not going to explain that because it really depends on what it is that you're referring to as an attribute. So, for example, if I have a movie theater, I might want ticket sales for my movie theater. Well, I need a thing on my website that sells tickets. That's a key system attribute. We're not saying how to build it, what to build, what it looks like. We're simply saying that being able to sell tickets on the website is a key system attribute that we feel will support that KPI of increasing ticket sales to a target result. And it can be failable. Maybe my platform that I chose, people hate because it's not really usable. So we replace it with something else. Valuable, it has some sort of value. Otherwise, why are you maintaining it? Why are you using it? And durable, it's something that can stand time long enough that that investment is worth the investment. If you're pouring money into maintaining something, that's not very durable. So maybe replacing that's a good idea. So again, fail early. So to define those KPIs and those KSAs, we have the concept still. You want to start with a workshop, both with your production team, your management team, that side of things, as well as your stakeholders. And this may be the same people if you're working in a department of a company. But if you're in an agency, oftentimes you have client stakeholders and you have your production team. And as you step through the workshop to identify, and I have a few examples of how to run some of those workshops and document that. You want to capture what it is that you define in the performance measurement framework document. So that way, anybody can reference it as you're going through a project, making decisions about priorities, doing system designs, doing visual designs, and just coming up with what you want to put in a release. There's a lot of stuff that you can do to make an improvement to something like a website, but how do you pick? Well, the guiding light should be the KPI, and somebody should know where to find that. So everybody on the team should know where this document is, and it is a living document. KPIs and KSIs should not be changing too much, but they can change, and we'll talk about that. So we want to get into that core analysis. That's that workshop with everybody. Define our KPIs, KSAs, put it into that document. But also, if you're going to invest yourself into this like lean startup sort of idea, it's what we refer to as the build, measure, learn cycle. So every time you make a release for your software, you're making an improvement. But it's not just, I want to build stuff because people keep pestering me about the feature they need. Those features should really align to how is it going to improve those KPIs. So you come up with the feature, the hypothesis for how it's going to have an impact on the KPI. You test it, so that's what you learn. And then you come up with new ideas for either removing it, improving it, replacing it, or even adding something new. And that goes into your build release. And then you measure again, you learn again, you build again, and that's the cycle. And the KPI dashboard is something that you monitor to help inform some of those things. So again, we'll talk a bit about that in a bit. And the dashboard can be something as simple as a Looker Studio sort of dashboard that looks at your analytics. If that's tied into your CRM or other data sources, that's something that you can monitor. It can be automated, it can be manual, but it's something that your team can look at when you meet. Not always a real-time thing, but it can be if it's important. But sometimes you pivot out of the build, measure, learn cycle. And that's because maybe there's a market change, maybe there's a business change, maybe there's an audience change. That's okay. OKRs, again, they're part of the release cycle. They should support the KPIs. They should be an indicator of success, and they're about short term. And it should align with what you can budget. You really can't just have pie in the sky ideas that you can't afford. You really have to keep that in check. So that's why it's good to keep it nice and small, and more importantly, achievable. So you start with those stakeholder meetings to define release specific OKRs. And that can just go into your release notes. Here are the things that we'd like to do. And more importantly, the OKRs are why you'd like to do them. And then release planning is going through and saying, here's what we'd like to do, put it in a backlog. And if you get through the whole backlog, wonderful. Then you can shift over to testing and doing other things like maintenance and whatnot, which can certainly be incorporated into your backlog as well. It's not just all about improving and aligning with KPIs, but that should certainly be a part of it. And that release plan document goes through the team and it can make that relationship with your objectives and key results. So there's an effort to this. Of course, you can go without KPIs and go without OKRs and go without a PMF. You can definitely do that. But again, having worked for an agency, we have to justify our expense. And I'm sure people who work in large organizations and in departments, you're accountable to somebody. So estimating an effort, the investment, if you will, is important. So again, having worked with agencies, sometimes clients that we would have on smaller monthly retainers, at least just start with KPIs because it defines the why. Why are you doing this? Why is this a better priority than doing other work? It just answered that question of why. And you can attribute it to trying to improve the KPIs. And you can stop there. That's totally fine. And you don't need a PMF document. You don't need regular meetings. That's fine. Small investment. And then for larger clients, whether it's a retainer or not, that's when you like those PMF documents, define it out, have a schedule, and have a dashboard to monitor your progress. So that way you're being more active, or proactive and accountable. So usually there's a bit of an investment just to get this set up. It's about 20 hours, really depending on the size of the team and the organization and the complexity of what it is that you're managing. But that's about what I personally usually budget. And then after that, because this is a routine thing, I say about 4 hours a month because you have a couple people on your team. You're responsible to somebody that you're presenting this to and making decisions, budgetary decisions about what work you want to do based on the analysis that you do. So who is involved? Well, stakeholders are involved. People who can make decisions. Subject matter experts are involved. Anybody that is a test user or even a live user has an impact because they help you learn, and you can survey them, interview them, use them in user testing workshops, things like that. Anybody in the performance measurement team is, of course, a part of that. So the intake process to gather this information and prepare it for use is really just starting with, again, those KPIs. How do you define them? Well, what are the business needs and the goals? And goals aren't, I want a great website. No, that's not it. If I, again, run a movie theater, I could run it without a website. It'd be harder this day and age, but I can. So instead, it's I need to make money to pay for the theater and the movies. I need to sell tickets. I need to book events, that type of thing. And what are the user needs? Maybe I have a movie theater in a college town, or maybe I have it in a retirement community, or maybe I have it like in a really big city where there's a lot of commingling of demographics. But we need to understand what those needs are because it shapes our business and what it is that we do in the products and services that we're trying to provide. What are the data sources? Again, if we're measuring something, what's responsible? You want one data authority for anything. You don't want things fighting for what the right number is. Like, what's our revenue? Well, is it in QuickBooks? Is it in some other software? Know what it is. So it's good to start with an intake survey for those stakeholders. And you can ask some really key questions to understand their role, how things are currently going, if there's something that already exists, if it doesn't exist, what would you like to achieve, and explore things like what does failure look like, and what must be there for you to succeed. And it's not about being right or wrong. It's just about gathering these answers. And surveys are good to get answers from individuals without them influencing each other directly. And then you can talk about those results in a workshop to figure out what to do. And we usually do that in triage. So you review those intake notes. You'll use some sort of a worksheet, and I can show an example if we have time of what that worksheet looks like, just to capture what it is that you've found through your investigation with stakeholders in your team. So in that worksheet, we'll document what are the business goals, what are the income sources and expenses to consider, because you want to help income, you want to make sure that you're not increasing expenses if you can help it, reduce them if possible. Not everybody will be willing to disclose things like income sources and expenses, but it's about being honest and being a team. And if that's possible, it can really make your job a lot better. Audience segments, who is uh, the group that you're serving and how are they segmented. So for example, at a university, that's oftentimes students, teachers, faculty, that sort of thing, sometimes parents. But that's not demographics. That's not a persona like Susie student. That's just identifying the groups and identifying their needs. Conversion funnels are really important because they are a really, really good indicator of what your KPIs might be. Critical activities, that is, if I know that somebody needs to fill in a form, well, that's one of those critical activities. If I know somebody needs to find movie times, that's a critical activity. And you're going to see some overlap between these things. That's good because you're trying to find different ways of getting to the same point. That is ideas for key performance indicators and key system attributes. So it takes a few rounds, some massaging. And here's a link at the bottom for an example of the worksheet if we don't get to it, but I do have it open in another tab if we do have time. So business goals are really important to define early on. Those income sources and expenses, conversion funnels, critical activities, audience segments, ideas for the KPIs and KSAs. Document those in that spreadsheet. Then the PMF document itself. Think of it kind of like a charter that you're putting together. It's the source of truth. It's the product of all of that research and meeting together to capture those ideas, to define them. So every time you meet, whether it's monthly, quarterly, yearly, you are looking at that PMF document and saying, hey, here's what we defined together. These are the important things that we're measuring. Here's the system attributes that we want to make sure are healthy and supportive of those. If not, then we kick them out and do something better, or nothing at all if it doesn't serve us. In that document, you explain what those what the PMF is. So that's just kind of a preamble. You say exactly what your KPIs are, your KSAs, and also identify the data source, measurement, and goals that you want for those indicators. An indicator is like if I'm driving down the road and I'm going 40 kilometers an hour, that's an indicator. I'm not saying to increase speed or decrease speed. It's just a visual indicator. That's all it is. But our intention for that might be reactive to, well, what is it currently and what was our goal? Our goal was 60, so we need to increase. How do we increase it? We can talk about what are the key system attributes. Are those helping? Or do we need to get more granular with it with ideas? And if you can, create a dashboard that people can reference. So there, again, there's a link to this document as an example. If we have time, we'll look at it. So then you'll review that as a team because you need to kind of codify this. You need agreement, you need consensus. And it's not about a democratic process so much as it is making sure that you don't miss something important and you have something that you can all just back. It's not about perfection, it's about effectiveness. So we want to make sure that at least we're measuring something and holding ourselves accountable for our success. You can make revisions. Pardon me. And KPIs can influence that design process and your backlog. And your key system attributes, they're just hypotheses. So if you build ticket sales on your movie theater website and it's just not working, and maybe your audience Maybe they're older and they just don't care. They want to call you or they want to go in person to get their tickets. I used to work at a historic theater. I know all about audience types that do things that are unexpected. They just didn't want to. They didn't feel secure putting their credit card in a website years ago. How are KPIs measured? Well, and the data sources, you really need to define that in that document. Otherwise, it will be inconsistent. And there's this idea of calibration. Some KPIs are complicated measurements. They're a formula that you have to define, and you want to make sure that that represents the truth. No false positives, no false negatives. So when you're setting up something new with a data source, sometimes it gives you data that you don't expect, and that's okay. You should expect the unexpected when you first start up a system for tracking data, and then monitor it, dial it in, calibrate it. Those target KPI goals and even stretch goals. Maybe I say year over year, I want to make 10% profit, but a stretch goal of 15%. That's important to define those, because if you can, year over year, you might say, hey, we're doing good. Let's change our goals. And that's okay. And those key system attributes are either validated, like you've tested them, you've proven that they have a direct impact on your KPIs, which can theoretically change over time, or they're just hypotheses. And it's okay. You can test that when and if you can. When you have these meetings to determine how are your PMF results, how are your measurements going? Are you succeeding? Do that as a group. Do it every month, do it every quarter, do it every year. Find out what cadence works for you based on what makes sense for you in terms of your release routines and improvements. So schedule those measurements. And I don't mean just have a real-time thing that's always has it. I mean, schedule them to measure them, capture them in a report, and then meet to review those results in a scheduled measure. And identify the objectives for the meeting. You're presenting the report. Maybe you're going over some ideas. Maybe monthly you don't go over ideas. You're just making sure that the data is being collected properly, or maybe quarterly. You're talking about short-term results and short-term planning. And then maybe yearly it's long-term results and long-term planning, which makes a big impact when you have budget constraints where you just don't have money and time and resources that you can keep throwing at things. So finding that cadence makes it very predictable, and it helps people who provide you those resources and funding kind of fit within their schedule and keep you constrained. So once you have all that ready, you prepare to measure. So set up all your data sources. Don't have Google Analytics set up? Great, set it up. Don't have Google Tag Manager registering when people hit certain buttons? Great, set it up. You can't retroactively collect data in a lot of scenarios. So the sooner you set it up, the sooner you have it. And it's not about just one data point, and especially when things are seasonal. It's about multiple data points to analyze trends. And that's where the KPI dashboard can show a lot of those trends if you set up appropriate graphs and see things over time. But calibration, accuracy, and clarity are really important when it comes to data. So start softly, be gentle with yourself and what the data actually means. You can say what your intentions are up front, and the data may not really cooperate well with you, depending on the data source and the behavior of people in a system. Schedule those data updates frequently. If they're not automated, make sure that they're collecting appropriately. And then get ready to discuss those results. Routinely review, schedule a recurring team presentation, have some internal evaluation before you meet with any key stakeholders or decision makers, and then prepare that in a presentation so that way it's nice and easy to understand. Use visuals as possible. Gather all your measurements, put them into observations. So here's something that's really important to me as someone who likes to do continuous improvements and be honest about the difference between data and emotion or ideas. Observations should be immutable. They should be simply, here's the data that we can see. I'm not telling you what it means. It's just the data that we see. Write it down, report on it. But then Resist reacting to it. Just keep that separate. Focus instead on what are the trends. Again, facts that you can point out. Then make recommendations. So based on the data, here's what we think. Here's what we feel. Here's perhaps something that we can do. First off is, okay, is the data honest? Are there false positives, false negatives? Do we need to calibrate this? And you want to get this done early. You want that dialed in because measuring data over time, if you're changing the formula or the method, it's not reliable. You want to get it to a point that it's dialed in and reliable over time. Then you want to test and validate the things that you built to support those goals, those key performance indicators. Research improvements and opportunities. Maybe you don't know what to do. Maybe there's an AI tool that maybe you're thinking about, but maybe you need to research it a little bit, do a prototype with it, but you don't want to invest too much. That's fine. Maybe you need to learn a little bit more about your audience. It doesn't matter what it is. Research is a recommendation. It's not always just about doing an improvement, but sometimes figuring out what an improvement could be. And then plan the work that you want to do, again, with objectives and key results and backlog recommendations. Enter that build, measure, learn cycle as you're going through this, and you can be a bit more routine. Follow that agile method if you can, but even if you're using waterfall, a lot of these methodologies still work to hold yourself honest for what success is. So if you can enter that cycle, that build, measure, learn cycle, you should see success moving that needle on your key performance indicators. But you can pivot. Again, you might have an audience change, a business change, something like that. That's fine. So you pivot, you change strategy, and you go back up to that core analysis. Ask yourself, are these KPIs still relevant? Are these KSAs still relevant? If they're not, you make changes to your performance measurement framework. You make changes to your KPI dashboard, and then you re-enter your loop. So from here, I want you to learn and practice. If you aren't familiar with any of these concepts, then now you have encountered them. If they're interesting to you, you can become more acquainted by reading up a little bit, or you can become even more familiar by studying them, reading books like Lean Startup, or learning a little bit more about growth-driven design and things like that. But study is never enough. In academia, I think there's plenty of folks who profess practice is equally important. You know, especially if you're in chemistry class or physics class, you need to see it work and you need to fail. A lot of experience is really just battle-hardened practice. And if you do something enough, you tend to become a master in that field. So if you want to learn more, find someone who knows more about this. Find a mentor, attend events like this, participate, study and practice, discuss this with other people, and present what you've been doing, because you can learn from just being vulnerable and being gentle with yourself. Sometimes new tools come out, new techniques come out, and practice with those too, and then repeat. Get familiar with it. So a few books to take a look at. Lean Startup we mentioned a few times. There's some training related to that as well. Growth-driven design. There's a HubSpot certification, actually a pair of them. There's one for agencies as well. Agile practices. There's so many books on Agile. It's ridiculous. And as for the examples, here's again some of the links to the things that I'll pull up in a second, just so you can see kind of the full worksheet that I'll use for intake, and then what I produce as that PMF document. But I'll pause on here. If you want to work with me to make improvements to your team, to really put things on the rail, or do anything related to information architecture, digital strategy, content strategy, solutions architecture, anything like that, those are the things that I love to do on a daily basis, improving websites and web applications. You can get in touch with me if you'd like, or if you'd like to see the slides, you can scan the QR code or hit this link down here. We're going to jump out of the slides. There's a couple minutes. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to toss them into the chat. But there were two examples that I cited. One was an intake form. So this is an example that uses that movie theater as an idea. So I have profits as my indicator, so I want to increase them. and I have a goal of 20%. Attendance, well, it's not just about selling tickets, it's about making sure that people come to the theater and actually attend the movies that they paid for. If it's too low, then they're not getting the word about their experience being great. And we certainly want that. I can tell you from movie theaters, they make a ton of money on concession sales. So those are something that we put in here, but it has nothing to do with the website if we're not using the website for concession sales. So this is a good example of how KPIs are not necessarily bound to the thing that you're working on, but being aware of it may give you an opportunity in the future, or at least trying to avoid harming it in any shape or form. Maybe it's just a handful of pages that says what's on the menu. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that will help your sales. But that's not up to me. That's up to you to figure out what those ideas are. You're just collecting information. Income, good to define that. Expenses, of course, there are expenses that you should be aware of in any organization, helping them, not hurting them, making them lower, not making them higher. Identifying your audience, whether it's for the website or for your business as a whole. Identifying conversion funnels and what group of people it might actually apply to, and any other critical activities that that in this case the website really probably needs to consider, and that gives you the ideas for the KPIs. These are things where we're identifying what the data source is, whether or not it's been approved by the team. There are certainly other things that we can look at, like concession costs, but maybe we're not calling those our KPIs today. And there could also be the growth engine, repeat attendance, cost of acquisition. Maybe those are good ideas to consider as KPIs in the future, but you don't want 20 KPIs. They are no longer key performance indicators. They're just indicators, they're just metrics. And metrics are fine. They give context to some of these things. And then key system attributes. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but maybe at least an event landing page and a form for people to book private events. And we can always explore this a little bit more as we need to. So that's the intake worksheet. And then you meet as a group to figure out what you want to do, and you massage that into place to codify this. And by codify it, I mean you have a document that says our key performance indicators are these things. When it comes to profits, here's where it's located, and here's what our goal is. Anybody can look at this document and understand what are the key performance indicators. How do we measure them? What are the goals? In addition to that, anybody can look at this and say, what are the key system attributes? What needs to be on the website to help us? And maybe there's some things that we tested. We know as a fact that this will help our KPIs. And there are other things that maybe we need to test to see if they are. In addition to that, we identify who is responsible for learning to help make improvements, who participates, and you tailor this to your team. You generate reports, so you identify how it is that you create reports. If you have a dashboard, you can link right to the dashboard here, so it's really nice and accessible. And then you come up with your team's cadence. What are you doing? When are you meeting? When are you going over this? When are you using this? Now, I said earlier, if you have a small team or a small client, they just can't afford much, you don't need this document at all. All you need to do is identify what are the indicators if we were to measure them, because that can at least help prioritize your work. Ideally, people should do this, hold their business responsible, monitor that progress, but you can't force people to spend money or do work that they're not willing to do. But bottom line, you really want at least key performance indicators to help guide your priorities for what work you should be doing, as opposed to, hey, AI is a thing. We should install AI modules because it feels like the right thing to do. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but what does that have to do with our KPIs? So I think there's a certain maturity and responsibility that I really want to convey through this. That's it. That's our presentation here. I'm going to pull up the slide again with these links if you wanted to be able to scan that QR code. But any thoughts, questions, concerns, feedback? That's my timer. Food for thought. Great session. Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that. If anybody does want to get in touch with me, again, you can get in touch with me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm certainly happy to see everyone here and do love my Drupal community. So you will certainly see me a lot over there. But thank you, Eric, for all the work that you do here for Stanford and in our Drupal community. And thank you, everybody, for attending. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great.
All right. Take care, everybody.